Welcome back, Flyers Nitty Gritty fans, to Getting Gritty with It with your host, Yariv, Wolok. And I have a special guest for the evening, somebody from outside the Philadelphia sports realm, Mike Committo. Mike is a author and hockey analyst as well. He has a new book, and I want to read the title to make sure I get it accurately. Hockey 365, the second period, more daily stories from the ice. This is the second edition. So if you guys are listening to it, there is a first edition. I believe this one just came out. Mike, thank you for joining. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw the shout out on Twitter for, that you were looking to do podcasts. I was like, let's get you on mine. So
yeah, that's the thing with being I think with being an author and I think the publisher of this book series, Dundern, does a great job, I think, working with their authors. But I think any first-time author realizes that if you really want to get your book out there, you've got to do a lot of the hustling yourself. And so I take all the shameless plugs that I can put out there to get on podcasts. I'm game. I'm down. So glad that we were able to connect and do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on because obviously, I mean, I looked into you a little bit prior to this, just in general to get your background. And obviously you've been around. I know you have ties with Sportsnet. You're a current writer for the LA Kings, right?
Yep.
And you've been around for quite a while. And I understand you have some connections as well within the industry and know people within. But for those listening, you are a Maple Leafs fan. I do want to get that out here first.
Yeah.
And that's not an issue, just so you're aware. I actually listen to a lot of, like I was telling you, I listen to Steve Dangle's podcast. I listen to a lot of Canadian hockey blogs in general, just because the content is just never ending. In the United States here, it's not always top of the mind. But interested to have you on. I want to start off talking about you. And I want to know, how'd you get into this? How did you get into, obviously this is your second book, I believe, that just came out. How'd you get into, making books? Is this kind of how you saw yourself kind of growing up, or did you have something in mind? Did you want to be a hockey writer of some sort?
Yeah, so that's a good question because, to be honest, when I was younger, I honestly had no idea what I wanted to do. And when I was a little kid, I loved hockey. I never played hockey at an organized level, but loved watching hockey, loved, attempting to play hockey on like an outdoor rink. And I love the history component, right? I was an avid hockey card collector, so I love collecting cards to learn, the backstories about players. I loved, they had a pro set put out a series of it was, each card was a different trophy in the NHL, right? So you got to learn why the Hart Trophy is called the Hart Trophy, why they called it the James Norris Memorial, like the Norris Trophy, all these sorts of things, right? So, and then as I got older, the history kind of stayed with me. And I ended up eventually, after kind of going to university, not really knowing what I wanted to do with my life, I finally got into history a little bit later in my academic career. And then I went on to do a PhD. And to be honest, once I kind of got into, the career track that I was going to do a PhD, I kind of figured a book would be in my future, just because typically the way it works is you finish your PhD and then at some point you have to turn your thesis into a book if you really want to get an academic job. But by the time I'd finished my PhD, I'd been working on it for 5 years and I got a full-time job. And then the hockey kind of had clicked while I was finishing my PhD again, because I realized I was writing all of these stories about topics that I was still interested in, but they weren't like, it wasn't going to be like a lifelong passion for me. My PhD was actually about the history of black bear hunting in Ontario. So that's a whole other conversation that we can unpack or not. But basically at that point in my life, like hockey writing kind of became like, I think, a creative escape where I got to do fun writing instead of the academic writing that I was doing. And so after I finished my PhD, I started to think a little bit more about what could I do on the hockey writing side of things. And I started to do like these weird mashups where I would take an anniversary in Canadian history, whatever day of the week it fell on, and then I would try to like forecast what was going to happen in the games in the NHL that night. So I would say, like, for example, today in Canada was the anniversary of the Statute of Westminster, and tonight the Senators are playing the Canadians, and here's who I think is the main storylines in this matchup, and here's who I think is going to win. So I did that for a while. Then I got an opportunity to do that for the Royal Half, which is a Kings blog, where I was doing it with California history and Pacific Division previews. And to be honest, like I think that really gave me the opportunity to, I think, be more confident in my writing, but also realize that if I was going to make it, in hockey writing, even as a side gig, I would probably have to figure out what it was I wanted to write about. And that's when I kind of stopped doing like the mashups and I just focused on hockey history. And then at that point, I just started to continue to try to get stories out there. I started doing some work with Vice and Sportsnet in the season of 2016-17. And then, halfway through that season, I started to realize that with the stuff that I was sharing on Twitter, I shared daily hockey history moments there, that with those daily facts, plus all the stories I was writing, I had a pretty decent portfolio of things I could draw on. And I thought maybe there's a book there where you could do, instead of what I was doing on Twitter, but we can turn it into a book and have one moment for every day of the year. And that's honestly how it kind of came together. It was the winter of 2017. I was on a beach in Mexico on our first vacation since our first daughter was born. And I was reading Val James's book, and he was the first Black player from the US to play in the NHL. And I, at that time, had a book contract to write my thesis as a book for University Press. And I remember just thinking, like, life's too short to get stuck in a project I don't want to do. Basically said, if I want to write a hockey book, I'm going to write a hockey book. And as soon as I got home, I called the University Press and said, like, I want to get out of this contract, which they weren't paying me any money, so it wasn't too much of a hassle. Okay. So I got out of that contract free and clear. And then I ended up starting the process to get a contract for this book. And that's essentially how the first book kind of came about. And that was 2018. And now, you and I are talking today, the second volume, the second period comes out next week in the US, but it's been out in Canada now for the last month.
Awesome. And those who are listening, please make sure to check out his book for sure, and check out both of them. So let me ask you this: why history? Like, what is it about history that kind of, pulled you?
It was honestly just, I think I've always just been drawn to it. I think getting to better understand the past was always something that interested me. I think obviously as I got older and started to make sense of the significance of history, I think I became drawn to it because the more you know about the past, the better you can contextualize the world around you. So I liked the aspect of the more that I knew about our history, I think the more informed I felt about what was currently going on in the world. And so that's honestly what I think probably sustained me as I figured out that's what I wanted to do as an adult. But as a kid, I think you're just drawn to the really cool stories, right? I mean, I think my first foray into history was probably with stories from the Second World War. I grew up watching like Indiana Jones movies and thinking like, sure, there's like, I want to read books about this now. And that really interested me. And then obviously as I got a little bit older, I realized that, here in Canada and the United States, there's a whole, wider history outside of, what I was watching on the silver screen, so to speak. And so, yeah, I think, and that's really what kind of got me into it, was just, I think, using history to better contextualize the world around you. And that's always what I would tell my students when I would teach, is that if nothing else, and I was teaching, once upon a time, a Canadian history class at a local university here in Sudbury, Laurentian. And I would tell them, like, I know that a lot of you aren't here, because you want to take history. Some of you are taking it as an elective, or you have to take a writing intensive course. So you're probably not going to come back to another history class. But I said, if nothing else, like, maybe this will give you a better appreciation, for the world you currently live in Canada, and better understand what's going on in the political landscape. And so that's, I think, what kind of got me going on it a little bit later as a career option.
That makes a lot of sense to me, actually. And, a lot of people kind of pride themselves on watching hockey. I've been watching hockey for 50 years, blah, blah, blah. Right. Mm-hmm. I've been watching hockey for 25 years myself. And, there is a lot of history that kind of explains why we're at the point that we're at today. And not many people are really aware of it or even that curious about it. And a lot of times I find that people kind of behave irrationally sometimes to seeing things the way they are. But at the same time, if you know the history of why things are the way they are, it allows you to kind of add context and maybe not take things, not the way they are at the surface level, right? To kind of understand the details, the nitty gritty, if you will, below it, and really understand it. And I feel like that's probably, like, don't take this the wrong way, right? It's like the nerd side in you, right? Yeah. That, like, you start off with, like, okay, like this team, right? Like the Maple Leafs, right? And then you're like, well, how did the Maple Leafs get started? Who started the Maple Leafs? How did they end up here? Did you find yourself kind of digging back, like early on, I guess, like digging back, like into certain teams, certain players, and just trying to figure out their full history?
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny because, like I said, it just kind of clicked where I think at that point I had realized that all the skills I was building as a historian could be applied to hockey. And I mean, I was always aware that sport history existed. I was aware of hockey history. Like, I had done readings in university about hockey and about sport. I just, for whatever reason, didn't see it as like a viable option for me to study. I thought that I'd be better off if I studied environmental history, because maybe I thought I'd have a better chance of getting a job versus if I studied hockey history. And so at that point, it was almost like I had to start playing catch up, right? Because I've been following hockey as a fan, since I was a kid. And obviously as I got older and you get into sorts of all different other things like getting to fantasy hockey. And, that's another way you kind of get involved in the game. And I was obviously reading a lot of hockey still, at least on the online side, reading what was going on with my favorite team. But then once I realized that there was this whole like other entry point for me to hockey from the historical side, I started just to start to read as much hockey history as I could. And I was just consuming book after book. I was doing my own digging. And honestly, I think, as much as I would say that I gravitated towards the Leafs, I think just in general, it was everything, right? I went back to find out about all the rule changes, like the formation of the league in 1917, what predated the NHL, like just to kind of better understand everything, right? And I think it's still one of these things where like you'll still never, even after doing this now, I think seriously for the last 6 or 7 years, there's still so much that, you have to cover. And obviously the sport is always evolving and the history is always evolving. So I think it's kind of this never ending pursuit where, as much as I think I'm obviously a much better hockey historian than I was 7 years ago, there's still such a big, hockey world out there that needs to be covered.
Yeah, absolutely there is. And I find myself learning even stuff about the Flyers like every year that I didn't even know about their history. So it's just like, it's almost like a never ending road. So why 365? What was the goal there? Because I believe it's like a story for each day of the year, right? Was the concept behind it. Why did you approach it in that manner?
Yeah, I think that actually stems from like what I've been doing on Twitter with like sharing daily moments in hockey history. And so I think that I started to notice around that point in 2017 that I was building a modest following there. At least it seemed like people who were there were obviously eager to get the daily facts that day. And certainly I'm not the only one, that shares daily hockey history moments. I think of Jen Conway, who's known as NHL History Girl, has been doing that for much longer than I have. And so I just kind of realized that if people were on my Twitter account waiting for like the facts that I would put out this day, maybe there was a way to take not the best fact of each day of the year, but try to pick one and use that as the entry point for that day, right? And so it seemed like that. Honestly, I think it's funny because when I first pitched the idea to Dunder and Press, the idea was that I would take all of the older stories I had written that are much longer, and then I would include those versions, and then I would have like these very short, like probably tweet length, stories that would kind of go in between. And then, they're kind of like, well, that's an interesting approach. Like, how are you going to decide which stories you're going to give like, 1,500 words to and which ones are going to get 200 words? And, we kind of realized that there's probably not a science there. And, a lot of these stories I've already told before. So like retelling them, it's not going to necessarily appeal to readers. They all basically have to be new in some way. And so we kind of settled on it. Each story should be a maximum of 1 page. And that's honestly how the book kind of came to be. I think Hockey 365 obviously has a nice ring to it. I will say that there are really 366 stories because I account for leap years in both books. But obviously it doesn't have the same ring to it, but you do get the February 29th entries in both books. But I just thought of like, word of the day calendars, those calendars that people have on their desks. It's funny because like I've always had one of those calendars on my desk that people would give me and I would never use it. You would come back to the office after 3 weeks have passed and you realize you've been stuck on the same date. So I'm not really using them, but I know that people do use them. I figured, maybe there was a way to blend what I thought was like a winning formula on Twitter with what I know about, the way that other people consume information. And that's honestly kind of how it came to be. I think with the first book, some of the stories kind of varied in length. You had some that went the full page and some were, maybe half a page or 3/4 of a page. With this new book, I think now knowing, how the first process went, each story is pretty much uniform. They're all pretty much the same length. So I'm pretty happy about that because they are, I like the uniformity of it much more in the second one.
Very, very cool. And yeah, I actually have one of those calendars, a Flyers one, somebody bought me that sits in the back there. And, surprisingly, I do tend to read like the little trivia thing on it. And I'm like about 70% accurate usually. Yeah. I get a lot of it wrong.
Yeah, I feel like if I had a hockey one, I would do that, but people would get me ones for work and you're like, well, I'm already at work. I don't know what kind of proverb I need to read today that's going to inspire me. Like if I had a Leafs calendar, like maybe I'd probably flip that over. So.
Well, for you, it'd probably be perfect, right? It'd probably you'd be like, oh, this will be the next topic.
Yeah,
you said you're doing it. You said you're going to do a third edition, most likely as well.
Yeah, so I think we have to, basically, I'm not locked in anything by now, but I think we're just kind of verbally locked into it. We actually, because this one's called The Second Period,
got to do a third.
We got to do the third, and they've actually gone as far as re-stylizing the first book. So the first book once they print new copies of it, it'll be called the first period, right? So you can't leave them hanging after 2 periods. So at least I have to complete regulation. Obviously, people have been talking about like we can do overtime, sudden death, double OT, triple OT, shootout, like it can go on and on, right? So we'll see. At least have to get through regulation, and then we'll worry about overtime a little bit later.
And then the overtime one, the pages can just go, every story can go 5, 6 different pages, right?
Everybody that's a good idea. I have to keep that in mind, actually. That's good.
Yeah, never, playoff overtime is the best.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. What was the process that you kind of used, and did it evolve from book 1 to book 2?
Yeah. So in the book, and it's funny because I actually ran into a colleague at work today who was nice enough to buy a copy of the book, and he bought a copy of the first book. And he told me today that he really enjoys the second book much more. And the reason why he said that was because he thought that in the first book, a lot of the stories that I covered were the most well-known ones that you already knew anyway. So like, there's a lot of Bobby Orr stories. There's a lot of Gordie Howe stories, Wayne Gretzky, like a lot of the stories that I think we've accepted as like, these are like the hallmarks of hockey history. Whereas in the second book, because a lot of those stories I use are off the table because I use them in the first one, I kind of had to think outside the box and say, well, I covered Gretzky's 802nd goal, on this day. So what are we going to do now? And so I think he said that he appreciated that I went more into the periphery and kind of talked about players, in events that maybe aren't, a top of mind and compared to some of the other events. And that truthfully was my approach. I think, in the introduction of the book, I talk about how I tried to be a little bit more, I think, quirky in finding moments in hockey history, because obviously I think hockey fans, I think it's at some level, they appreciate the history of the sport. But I think that even the fans that aren't history nuts appreciate those off the wall moments where they say, I had no idea that happened. That's wild that the Detroit Red Wings played a game, in prison in the 1950s, which they did. And I covered that in the first book. So I tried to put more of that in there, but I think you're still going to find a lot of the tried and true stories in this book. But I did, because of the fact that I had to kind of work off of knowing that there was 366 stories that were off limits. You kind of had to be a little more creative. And I think that kind of gave me some more opportunities to include stories that otherwise wouldn't have made, the first book. But I also think that just becoming more, evolved in my writing and more confident as a writer and as a historian that, I think there's stories that I wouldn't have told in the first book that I told in this book, just because I think now you have a little bit more credibility and you can kind of take the risk. Whereas as a first time author, I'm not going to put in a story about, Ariana Grande getting hit by a puck at a Panthers game, but I could put that in this book because why not?
Yeah. No, I love that. No, a lot of creativity and a lot of the best innovations are usually done under limitations. So it's kind of like you realize that you have these limitations, and now you're going to have, with the third book, hopefully, right? You're going to have even more limitations. And, something, there's the hockey guy on Twitter. I don't know if you ever listen to him, or not on Twitter, I'm sorry, on YouTube. And I really like this guy, and he just does everything from his house, and he covers every team. And the one thing that I heard him talk about, actually, and it's a great point. He's like, I have content for every team in the league, like even the less popular teams, right? Yeah. And I imagine with the first edition, right? You're talking about Gretzky, you're talking about Lemieux, you're talking about Gordie Howe, right? You're talking about these guys that everybody knows, but a lot of these stories are already been covered by media, and they're drawn to death, right? But then once you get past those top stories, you kind of have these more intricate, interesting stories that, maybe some franchise will be like, oh yeah, most people didn't know that we actually did that, and then we had a game there. And it's not on the news all the time. So I feel like maybe that is kind of where some of those golden moments are. And you're kind of shedding light on history, kind of lost in the shuffle, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's funny because I think hockey, or at least from the NHL perspective, they do a pretty good job celebrating their history.
Sure.
The 100th anniversary was just a few years ago, and there was obviously a big run up to that. But it's still just interesting how even a story that I mentioned where the Red Wings went and actually played a game, an exhibition game, obviously in a prison in Michigan against a bunch of prisoners. And you would think that that's a story that's just pulled from the movies, right? I mean, you think of the movie, The Longest Yard, that's essentially that, right? Where Gordie Howe's playing on a line with a couple of inmates. They swap they started playing the game with the Red Wings against the inmates, and then they realized that this was not going to work because these NHL players were obviously going to, skate circles around these guys. So they ended up mixing in the players. So they were all playing on 2 separate teams. So you had the Red Wings playing with prisoners against Red Wings and prisoners. And it's just and I mean, I think a lot of the hardcore Red Wing fans probably know that story,
Yeah.
but it's still surprising that even some of those fans from that group, and I think from beyond, the Detroit fan base, just think of the story, be like, how did I not know that? I mean, I know that it happened in the 50s, but still, like, that's a story where you'd think that's kind of become like, just, part of the hockey history lore.
I've never heard that story, and it's like already now, like you're telling me a little bit. I'm like, all right, I got to dig into that a little bit. I gotta see visually what that looked like, or
yeah, there's some good pictures of it. It's actually pretty hilarious because I don't know if I think I mentioned this in the book, but they actually they presented the Red Wings with a trophy, and it was called the Honeypot Trophy, and Honeypot is what you would use like to go to the bathroom. So basically, they presented this with this trophy that they'd made, and the Red Wings still have it. I spoke with the archivist who works for the Detroit Red Wings and the other Detroit sports groups, and they have it like in the new arena, like in the basement where they keep all of their stuff. This Honeypot Trophy, right? So I like to joke that obviously the Stanley Cup is number one, but the Honeypot is number two.
Yeah, so. I mean, honestly, when you think about it, it's such a rare thing that happens. It's one of those things where you're kind of like, yeah, it's pretty special. Because it's probably never going to happen again.
Yeah.
So it's almost, in a lot of ways, it's more unique than the Stanley Cup, right? Which is given out every year. It's like, this is something that it's a relic of time. That's a very cool story. Already this is coming out with a cool story. So let me ask you this. You've honestly gone through this process twice already. If you had to look at the game, I guess we don't have to go, this is kind of a general question, so it's kind of tough to answer. You have to go kind of maybe like the earlier days. Let's talk about the Gretzky days, right? Or even earlier than that, if you really want to go back, depending on how easy this is for you to answer. And then you talk about where the game is today. What are some of the things that you notice that are kind of like the biggest differences? And I know that obviously like there's speed, there's size, but there's anything outside of that you kind of notice that you pick up like culturally, and obviously there's rule changes and whatnot, but just like big changes.
I mean, I think the one that I always go back to is just how much the sport itself has evolved. Like, I mean, I'm not talking about the advances to equipment or anything like that, but just the actual way that the sport is played. Because again, as a historian, and you see these debates come up every so often, like, well, we can't increase the size of the nets, or we can't increase the size of the goalie pads. Like that would go against the fabric of the sport. Like, we can't change all of this stuff. It's like, well, once upon a time, like we didn't even play, we didn't allow the forward pass. There was no such thing as offside. They eventually brought in that, and they brought in icing, they brought in penalty shots. And it's funny because like when you go back, like basically in the early years of the NHL, when they were playing, the Stanley Cup against teams from the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, which was the group of clubs out on the West Coast, which included like the Seattle Metropolitans, who were the first U.S. club to win the Stanley Cup. Like, they would play with an extra skater, like kind of like a rover, right? So whenever they would play the teams from the NHL, they would alternate the rules for these games. And so on the games when, the West Coast based team was at home, they played West Coast rules. So then the NHL teams had to put an extra skater on the ice. So it was 6-on-6. And, it's just like, that's how the sport kind of evolved. And then the West Coast teams also were more advanced at first with the forward pass. The NHL didn't allow it for a number of years. The NHL also kind of avoided things where like goalies couldn't drop down to the ice to make a save. They had to stay in a standing position. They even went as far as in some of the previous leagues to fine goaltenders, a couple bucks if they went to the ice and sprawled on the ice, which is now ridiculous, right? Because obviously the position evolved into, the butterfly, which a hallmark of that is like flailing all over the place and dropping down, to your knees. And so for me, I think that's always a thing that always just, I always go back to, is just like how much the sport has actually changed, from a rules perspective over the years, right? Obviously significantly, in the after 1917 up through the 30s. Obviously, I think at some point you kind of reach a sweet spot where you weren't tinkering so much with the rules. Obviously, we saw some rules, not that far back when they brought in the trapezoid, they brought in the shootouts. Like, obviously, these aren't necessarily changing the structural integrity of the game, but it's been a sport that's constantly evolved throughout the years. And I think that's the thing I always come back to, especially when we have these debates about, do we change this to allow for, for improvements to the game? I mean, 3-on-3, that was one where I just think now, like, that it took a long time for that to happen, but just think of how much actually that has improved. I think some of the outcomes in the sport during the regular season, like we're talking today, last night, this is not going to help me with the Flyers listeners, but the Rangers and the Leafs probably had one of the best regular season overtimes I can remember in recent years, right? It was just back and forth, end to end. And I mean, who's going to say that that's better? That's not better than a shootout. Obviously, we know that that's better in a shootout. But again, that's an improvement. That's a change that's been made. I think that one's one that's been made for the better. But certainly, I think that's just always been a hallmark of hockey. I think that it's always evolving.
Yeah, no, it's a great answer. And it's kind of what I was referring to earlier, where, if you understand the history, and again, I didn't know, I'm not going to have the depth of history that you do. But, some of those things where, you talk about equipment, you talk about the changes, you talk about things happening. It's like, to a lot of people, they're like, oh, that's never happened before. But if you actually understand history, you'd be like, well, it has happened before, or something like it has happened before. And we evolved and we moved past it. Like, think about the idea of hockey without a forward pass. Like, that's crazy to me. And it kind of like lets you know why the NHL moves the way it does, right? It does tend to be a little more conservative when it comes to changes as it is. But having said that, I think it actually got a lot better. And I think the 3-on-3 example is a great one, right? Where it's something that, they put in action pretty quick once it was actually decided on, and they haven't looked back. And I feel like the NHL is more open to changes. Do you think that the playoffs, the intensity, has ramped up, or do you think it's just been the same? Like, is it like back in the day? Because it's always been a grueling sport, right? Physically. Is it more grueling today? Is it just different grueling? Like, do you have it like history that kind of ties back to that? I know there was obviously more fighting back in the day, but do you find that the playoffs are different? Obviously the structure was different too.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly the intensity factor, I think it's still there, but it's obviously displayed in different ways. I think, if you were to look back further into time, you would see, it was more common for fights to break out in the playoffs. I think it's been like in our lifetime, it's rare to see a fight in the Stanley Cup final. It does happen from time to time. I think most people probably think of like Iginla and Le Cavalier, back in, 2004. But beyond that, like you could probably put name a handful, right? And they probably don't even come near the intensity of that one. But I think, for me, what's interesting now is you kind of see just how much better the goaltenders are, and, how the equipment has changed things, is that I think because as goaltenders have become more skilled over the last 20, 30 years, but obviously I think more recently, we're starting to see, I think anecdotally, I don't have any facts to back this up, but I think you're starting to see those overtimes go longer than they did before, because I think you have players who are more skilled. You've got players who are at better fitness levels. So it's not like this grueling, their bodies can handle a type of event. And so I think we start to see that more often, where like now, I don't think I think there was probably a time where it was less common to see those, those triple, quadruple overtimes. Obviously, I think we'll never get back to necessarily where we saw in the 30s, where they would go on until like 2 a.m. I think the longest game was, I think, a quintuple overtime back in 1936.
I didn't even know that.
It's like, that's a grueling, pace on your body, but obviously those players were very different back then. And so if you put the same players in that game now, like, I think they're better able to handle it. So I think that's always the thing. I think what's interesting though, is that like, no matter how much you change the rules or how more advanced players become or how more advanced equipment becomes, I think knowing that the Stanley Cup is on the line, like players are going to go through the wall in the playoffs. Right. And so I think no matter how more, focused they are on their skill development or, trying to just keep their endurance up in the playoffs, that, they will literally go through a wall if it means that I can, get that goal that'll get us to the next round or keep us alive in the series, with the chance of getting that Stanley Cup. Because I think, no matter who you are as a hockey fan, or even if you were a casual fan as a kid, like that's still the best trophy in sports. And I think anyone who's even played casually as a kid probably, has these like daydreams or fantasies, or, they acted out winning the Stanley Cup. And I think it's just one of those things where when you're living it and doing it, that that kind of the will to try to get that trophy could just kind of overrides everything else.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. Let me ask you this, and maybe this is a little too broad of a question, but I assume you studied history as well, maybe more Canadian history, but I'm sure you're just a fan of history in general. Did you find, as you were doing your research and kind of like what you're correlating with what you knew about history in general, did you find a correlation between the history that was going on around the world and kind of things that happened in hockey? Did you find that the sport was affected by, maybe larger world events that were probably more important than hockey, but did you find that it kind of correlated where you saw kind of changes in hockey, around times that where maybe society was changing more? Like, did you find correlations there?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like even as part of some of the, the classes I took in undergrad, so I'll say this first, that like my research, for my master's, my PhD was focused on environmental history. So I was studying first forest fires and then, black bear hunting. And so as far as like larger societal trends, they were really just focused on hunting. And I mean, but as part of that, leading up to those studies, like I'd taken courses that kind of focused on like broader global events in Canada and beyond. And I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is obviously the Second World War. You have players in Canada and the United States who are enlisting or who are, to go serve their country. And so that's a time when you actually, if you go back and look at the NHL, you'll see that there were more younger players who were making, appearances in the NHL simply because other players had gone off to fight and to serve. And so you had like even like marquee players that did this. I think of, Frank Brimzik, who played for the Blackhawks. Like he was at the pinnacle of his career, and he went off to serve for the United States, and he left for 2 years. He came back and he still played incredibly well. I think, he didn't win another Hart when he came back, but he was in contention for it. So, I mean, I think that's one where, no matter what's happening, like I think the hockey world is a microcosm of the larger world in general. Right. And so, I mean, even though these guys were professional athletes, like they still felt the call and the sense of duty to serve their country. And they went in droves, and, some of them died serving their country or came back, shells of their former selves. But ultimately, I think that's one where you can kind of see that this is a massive global event that's happening. And obviously the hockey world is not insulated from that. But I just think of, there's an example I have in the first book, with the Bruins, and, they had that famed Kraut line because the three players were of German heritage and they were Canadian. But they volunteered to go serve during the Second World War. And in their final game before going to serve, they were playing the Canadians, and the Canadians players like picked them up and hoisted them on their shoulders and kind of carried them off the ice. Right. And so even the fact that like these are the Bruins and Canadians, they've got a fierce rivalry. I think that camaraderie and the respect for these guys going to serve kind of trumped, any rivalry that they had. Right. They realized that these guys are doing something greater than just playing hockey, and they deserve that send off that they got.
Oh, that's a cool story. I love that story, actually. That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
The reason I asked you that is obviously we're dealing with, COVID and how it's affecting the world. And I think about how much it's affected our sport, just even in the recent times. And I don't even think the effects of it really are, kind of what I was saying to you before, right? Under limitations is where you create the best problem solving. So I think the NHL will probably be forced to evolve even more now after COVID. So I was kind of thinking about like, I do find usually there is a correlation with that. And that's a very cool story. I imagine it united the league kind of in weird ways, like united players, just, I know it's already a small community in the hockey world as it is. But I imagine, it even goes up a level around that time.
Yeah.
And I would imagine financially the league was probably also hit at that time as well.
Yeah, well, because you especially had people who didn't go off to serve, but obviously were doing wartime jobs and things like that to keep everything running, right? And so I think you had an issue of people going to games, or obviously this wasn't a priority, and so obviously that kind of put a damper on like people going through the gate for games. But certainly I think to your point, given the fact that like at that time too, there was only 6 teams in the league, right? So the number of players is much smaller pool than it is now, right? So ultimately, knowing that many of these guys from this small group went off to serve, I think kind of you get a better appreciation for what you do off the ice than necessarily what's happening on the ice all the time.
Oh, that's a great point too. I didn't even consider the fact that the league was much smaller at the time as well. What kind of tight knit group that probably was. So. Looking back at history, and then I do want to get into some stories as well, but looking back at history, do you find that you have any predictions on things that you might see arise, just kind of going back in history and seeing how the league, adapted to certain things? Do you have any kind of predictions of your own that you think might happen, in the near future or down the line with the sport itself?
Well, I'll say this one because I don't know if it's a prediction, but it's something I've been trying to will into existence for the last number of years, right? Is when we talk about how can the NHL look to increase scoring? Obviously we've talked, they've changed, the size limitations for goalie equipment is one that we've seen recently. There's been talk about making the nets bigger. I don't think that one's necessarily going to happen, but one that I've thought that you can, I think, increase scoring by changing some subtle elements of gameplay, right? And one thing that I've been lobbying for is that the NHL goes back to when you get a minor penalty, you serve the entire minor penalty, regardless of how many power play goals the opposing team scores. So this was something where back in the day, you would serve your entire minor penalty. It didn't matter how many times the team scored on you. You sat in the box until your 2 minutes was up. And they eventually brought in a rule because the Canadians were feasting on opponents. They had like a power play unit that was basically 5 future Hall of Famers, from John Beliveau to Doug Harvey. So whenever these guys were out on the ice, like you were done, right? Like they were going to get one by you. There was basically the lead up to this was Beliveau scored 3 goals on one single power play. And when they had their annual meeting, like all the other general managers were like, this is ridiculous. Like we've got to get rid of this rule. Like there's got to be some change here. And so, they put that rule in place where after the goal is scored, the player returns to the bench and, you go back to even strength. So my thinking is that if we go back to you serve out your minor penalties, you'll see more goals because the teams will score more power play goals, right? If you give them a full 2 minutes to do it, that's one way you'll get more pucks into the net.
Yeah, it's a great point. And not only that, you might get those big scorers again, right? Like we don't have any 70 goal scorers anymore in the league, right? Even hitting 60 is so difficult. But all of a sudden you give, somebody like Alexander Ovechkin's a little bit older, but you give him a little bit of time, right? Let's say he's feeling hot that day and he has 2 power play goals. Well, what can he do if the power plays don't expire? He can get a lot more than that. I remember watching a game with the San Jose Sharks. I think it was last season, maybe the season before, where they had a 5-minute major, right, which falls under what you're talking about. They were down. I think they were down 5-1, and they ended up winning the game based off that 5-minute major. So that'd be a good example.
Yeah, that's in this new book. That was against the Golden Knights, right? And it was basically game was in the bag, and then they scored. I think 3 goals on the power play. Vegas ended up tying the game. They went to overtime, but then the Sharks won in overtime, right? But because of that penalty, it pretty much kind of, they probably should have been able to kill that, but yeah, that's.
But no, to your point though, like I remember watching that game live, and there was a humongous momentum swing on that power play, and it is a way to kind of change the game with it making a subtle change too, not an immense change, and it just kind of changes the way you strategize. Probably would up the value of penalty kill players too. So it would probably affect the salaries.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that was the other thing I was thinking too, as you were saying that, is that obviously with somebody like an Ovechkin or somebody who's a power play specialist, that if you now suddenly know that each power play that your team's going to get is going to run the full 2 minutes, your role becomes that much more important, even if it's incrementally. But that's a way that a player can prolong their career by, we're not going to play you 15 minutes a night anymore, but we're going to put you in front of the net on our power play for 2 minutes. And you're going to bang in as many pucks as you can, right? And then ultimately that's, you can still score goals. You can still be valuable to the team. So yeah, I think it's a subtle thing, but ultimately it would kind of ripple throughout in kind of fun and unique ways, right? So
yeah, that's a great answer actually, because I think it's a practical answer where it's one that I could see discussed. I don't know if it's going to be approved, but I could see it discussed at some point because scoring is important. People love goals. Defense is more for like the hockey nerds, where the average viewer, they want to see goals. They don't necessarily want to see a 1-0 game, a 2-1 game all the time. And then the idea of like even making the equipment smaller on the goalies, I don't necessarily have a personal problem with it. But then when you hear that they start, they're feeling the puck extra, that like it's starting to hurt. It's like, okay, now we're getting into like safety issues.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of consequences there. But that's a really good one. So let's get into some specific stories. So this is a Philadelphia Flyers podcast. We talked about this a little bit before, and hoping that you have, and again, I don't want you to reveal, everything from your book. I'm not trying to ruin, the reason that people will go out and buy your book. But if you have any stories that you're willing to share about the Flyers, that'd be cool. And, if there's anything else, I mean, you shared a couple really good ones already. But anything about the Flyers or anything else that you want to share, that'd be great.
Sure. And actually I want to say this one because I don't know if we'll be able to, if I'll find another way to kind of include this, but
sure.
I've had this like connection with Claude Giroux, like as a fan, probably for the last 10 years. And it's funny how it kind of came about. So like, I've been a big Claude Giroux supporter for a number of years, still am to this day, obviously, but the way it kind of came about is funny because I live in Sudbury, Ontario, and, Claude, before he went to Ottawa, was living in Hearst, which is like this, French speaking town, like far northern Ontario. And one of my buddy's fathers, used to coach, his sons when they were playing hockey. And, the buddy I'm talking about now, Scott, he's a little bit younger than I am. So he's around Claude Giroux's age. And they went to this hockey tournament in Hearst. And, I remember, like, this was years later, obviously, because I didn't know this guy at that point, but we were at a bar, before we were going into, it was right before the playoffs in 2010. And we're out for drinks, and, my my buddy's dad is there, and he's talking about how, like, we went to this tournament in Hearst, and this kid, Claude Giroux, like, he was incredible. Like, he was just like head and shoulders above all the other players there. I couldn't believe, like, how good he was. And, like, my friends corroborating this and saying, like, yeah, like, he's insane. And at this point, this is, Giroux, I think at that point had been drafted maybe 2 years before that. He hadn't played, really, I think that was the year he'd played pretty much most of a full season. And so I remember, kind of just thinking, oh, wow, that's cool. Like, I don't know who Claude Giroux was at the time, right? I wasn't a Flyers fan. So it wasn't a name that registered with me. But then, we go to our draft a couple of weeks later, and, I think that was the year where, like, the Flyers had to get into the playoffs, like, on the last day or something, or there was some kind of weird swing where I wasn't even sure, like, who we would get. So I remember we were getting late into the rounds, and, my buddy and I are kind of looking at each other, being like, I don't know who to pick now. Like we're getting into the nitty gritty here. And I just say, like, Claude Giroux still on the list, man. Like, I was just with Brian the other night. He talked about how great, Claude was, like, playing in Hearst. Like, let's take Claude Giroux. And obviously, like, he had an incredible playoffs in 2010. We know how the story ended, obviously not, the way that Flyers fans would want, but ever since then, because we were so close to winning, we didn't win. But we ended up winning a lot of side bets because we got Claude Giroux, and he ended up getting, I think, like 21 points. Yeah. And he was a really late round pick for us. So, like, he saved our butts that year. So ever since then, I've been a big Claude Giroux booster.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, he's a performer, and I personally, he's maybe my favorite Flyer of all time. And we talk about it quite a bit. I don't really think he's appreciated as much, as just because the team hasn't been as successful, but it's not really been his fault. And right now, I think he's number 3 in points all time for the Flyers. If he continues his career with Philly, and I think there's a good chance he probably will, there's a good chance he'll finish second. He could even catch Bobby Clark if he continues going on his stretch. So it's a player who, I think history will look back on very fondly, quite figuratively.
Yeah, it's pretty funny too when you think that, like, Bobby Clark, forgot his name when he drafted him, and now he's, like, nipping at his heels for some of these records, right? So it's fitting.
It's very, very fitting. It's one of those perfect moments in history, I think, that, it's like how if you were to make a movie, and the guy forgets his name, and then he's like, well, one day I'll be trying to catch you. And also it turns out to be also a redhead. And it's just like, we have this whole thing with redheads, and I don't understand it, but we keep having redheads who are really good on our team. With the orange jerseys. It's funny. So do you have any other stories that you're willing to share? Like, and it doesn't have to be recent stories. Like, it could be definitely older stuff or anything like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I made sure to this time include, there's that, the series against the Soviets in 76, where the Flyers basically, like, run them out of the building. There's that, like, famous line that Bob Cole says, like, they're going home, like, and they eventually came back and returned to the ice, and they finished the game. And I just love that story, because this is when the Flyers are obviously in their heyday as the Broad Street Bullies. And, I went back and looked at some of the newspaper, accounts at the time, and they interview Bobby Clark. And, at the end, the Soviets are talking about how they've never played against such animals, and, like, this is such an animal hockey team, and, like, boxing's not a part of hockey. And then they interview Bobby Clark, and he says that wasn't even one of our rougher games. And so I just thought that's an interesting, time capsule of that moment. Again, I think of the significance of the Cold War and these two teams kind of playing each other. So I had that one. So you've got something that goes back, 1976, but then I've got some more recent ones. Obviously another one that probably, might not necessarily, be a good one for Flyers fans, but, trading Richards and Carter in 2011 was another one I covered. But I think another one that I kind of enjoyed kind of getting back and looking into was, when Tom Bladen scored 8 points in a game, 1977, he beat Bobby Orr's record for the most points in a game by a defenseman. Bobby Orr had never scored 8 points in a game, but Tom Bladen becomes the first defenseman to do that. And it's funny because as I dug into that story, you kind of get like all these interesting anecdotes that you wouldn't have known if you just look at the game sheet and see like, wow, he obviously had a great game, set a record. But just these kind of cool things you hear about after the fact, when people cover the post game stuff, and that, Bladen's nickname among his teammates was normally Sparky. And that night they were calling him Bobby because of Bobby Orr, right? And he hated that they called him that because he thought that obviously Bobby Orr is Bobby Orr, and Tom Bladen was still a great player, but he was obviously not Bobby Orr, and so he just resisted being called Bobby. He hated the comparisons that were being made to him about Bobby Orr and all this stuff, but obviously it was natural that they would make the comparison because even Bobby Orr didn't have an 8-point night, and so I liked that one because you get to hear some of the other stuff that you didn't maybe necessarily know as somebody who didn't grow up watching the Flyers in the 70s, and that. I think Bladen was obviously one of the more gifted, offensive defensemen of his era. But I think given how passionate Flyers fans are, they can be fickle sometimes when the defenseman turns over a puck or, doesn't necessarily defend, in their zone. And so like Coach Fred Shearer used to joke that he wanted to put earmuffs on Bladen when he was on the ice so that he couldn't hear the fans booing him. And so obviously that night, he didn't need the earmuffs because there were no boos. It was just cheers, from the fans that night.
That's like a Shane Gossesberry here who just left town. I mean, that's a guy who I think he has 4 assists in 3 games right now. He led the defense in points last year. And if you ask a lot of like hockey Twitter, you'd have no idea that he led the Flyers defense in points last year. You would think he's the worst defenseman in the National Hockey League. Hey, let me ask you this actually, because that brings up a good point because you're talking about statistics here. How do you feel about stats? And I guess we can throw analytics in here, even though it wasn't really around through history, right? It's more of a modern era thing. But how do you think that reflects upon history? Do you find it to be accurate, or do you find it to be, what's the word I'm searching for? It kind of like can throw off some of the context, right? Because that scoring has changed throughout the ages. It's harder to score. Mm-hmm. It was actually harder to score before. Now it's getting a little bit easier. But how do you feel it reflects upon history well?
I think it's an interesting one because I think it's funny as somebody who tries to be a hockey historian. There tends to be a tendency to kind of value, I think, the input or opinions of people who had lived through and could attest to watching Bobby Orr. And I know that obviously I was never alive when Bobby Orr played. And obviously me watching YouTube clips isn't going to give me the full Bobby Orr experience. And I've seen extended clips, but obviously, it's hard to get full games of some of these eras, right? You'll obviously never watch a game that was played, in the 20s or 30s, right? So you have to use the information that's available for you to make an assessment of how that player was, right? So that requires reading about how do people feel about this player? How do people, view this team? How are they covered? What types of opinions do reporters, from that market have? Were there other opinions from other reporters who cover this team in other markets? And that's really kind of that you kind of have to take what you have. And I think now we're in an era where you obviously have the availability to go back and watch, any game that's available to you. If you have an NHL, center ice account, you can kind of go back and watch. You obviously have the analytics that kind of tell an additional story, and then you've got what's being talked about by the writers and the analysts that cover the teams, right? So I think now more than ever, we have an abundance of information to kind of make our own assessments. But honestly, I still struggle with some aspects of the sport where, there's this tendency to view people who you didn't watch this team or you didn't watch this player. So how can you comment on whether they should be considered the best player of all time? I watched this player growing up, so my opinion is more valuable than yours. And it's funny as a historian because that's never even a consideration as a professional historian, because no one's going to say, well, Mike, why should you write a book about World War II? You didn't live through the war. It's right. Well, of course I didn't. But I mean, we wouldn't have any history if you relied on first person accounts only. And so It's kind of one of these things where in this sport, I think we value the opinion of people who have been there, when in reality, I think there's now more tools and information at our disposal that people who didn't necessarily live through those eras, I think can make their own assessments based on the abundance of information that we have.
Absolutely. I think my issue sometimes with the stats stuff too, is that I think some great players are forgotten about because people are looking for greatness in stats, where some people were just a large impact on the ice or a large impact to the game. Obviously like with the bullies, right? We talk about Dave Schultz, right? Who has
Mhm.
immense amount of penalty minutes, right? But there was a whole group of guys who were very physically intimidating then, who probably majority of the league doesn't know, right? And then there's other guys who probably produced really well, but maybe not well enough to be Hall of Famers, and then they get forgotten about. Or there are great players that never played on great teams, which also would bring their stats down. And I guess that's kind of where I get lost with it, because it's at the end of the day, it's a team sport too. And while some players are, I guess, as large as the game itself, I always I worry about losing the nuance of that. We see that stuff with like the draft, right? Where you have guys who have great stats and people are like, oh, he's the best player in the draft. And then 2-3 years down the line, you found out that the guy taken at 10 is the best player in the draft, right? And he didn't have as good numbers, stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I think now we're able to quantify things more, and I think we have more information. But at the end of the day, to your point, it's still a team sport. It's still such a high tempo, fast sport that you can't calculate everything. I think there's still those intangibles that we still can't measure. Again, I think even in an office or in a workplace, like there's intangibles of people on your team that make them a good part of the team and why the team works so well. You just focused on, well, his output or her output is great, but no one likes to work with them. You probably don't want them on your team, right? And so I think since hockey is a microcosm of life, you're going to have those things, right? And so I think that I agree to an extent that I think there's a tendency, I think, for people to find these numbers or these metrics that they want to just throw out there without any context. And I think if you're going to do that, it's important to have, I think, the context and the storytelling to go with what those numbers are saying, right? I think of like Allison Lucan does a great job of like data-driven storytelling, where tell me what the stat means and then kind of give me an example of why it makes sense in this context, right? And I think that if you're just throwing the numbers out there to kind of show off or I don't know, present a case or present an argument that maybe backs up your own perspective, that's kind of where I get lost too. I want to see, like, show me this and what does it mean and how is it valuable and how can we, contextualize it. And I think that's, I think there's a place for that for sure.
Well said. I like that. And I'm not against analytics at all. In fact, I work in technology, so I understand it comes from tech as well, how heavily everything is based in analytics. And there's definitely a value to it. I just feel like a lot of people use it backwards. Like they end up chasing the analytics rather than chasing the narrative and then applying the data to the narrative. And I like what you said, that there's a story to tell around it. And that's probably the most important thing, that then it's backed up by the data. And that's how I totally see it. So let's get into the last segment here. Let's get off history a little bit. Let's talk about current. Obviously you're part of the LA Kings. I know you, obviously, to repeat again, you're a Leafs fan, right? You grew up a Leafs fan, right? But I wanted your opinion on the league itself. Like, anybody stick out to you that you think, like, who are your top teams in each division? And, and how do you see things playing out? And obviously there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just curious to get your take.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'd be remiss as a Leafs fan if I didn't say that the Leafs were kind of at the top of my list, for the Atlantic. But I do like the Panthers. I like what they've been building towards. Obviously, I think that, if they can kind of solve some of their goaltending challenges they've had, over the last couple of years, that they're an interesting team that obviously I think could present some challenges for other teams in the Atlantic. So I'd say, like, for me, I'm not going to say Boston because they've been terrorizing the Leafs for, the last 5 years. In Tampa Bay, I think it's one of those things where, as much as a three-peat would be interesting, it's also more interesting to see somebody else like win a cup, right? Like, I think it could get boring when it's the same teams winning every year. I think you want to see somebody else hoist that trophy. And so I wouldn't have them up there. I mean, going over to the Metro, I've always been a huge Alex Ovechkin fan as well. I just love, his approach, like his charisma off the ice, the way that he's, forthcoming. He's obviously an incredible goal scorer, will go down as the best goal scorer of all time, even if he doesn't catch Gretzky's record. But I think obviously with, the focus on Ovechkin over the next few years now, that Gretzky record is viable. I think the spotlight's going to be on him. But I think ultimately, I do like the Flyers. I was high on them a couple of years ago. Obviously things didn't go, well last year, but things just, what are we looking at right now? I know they don't have a win yet, but
no, we just won. We just beat
last night.
Seattle. Yeah, we won 6-1.
Oh, that's right.
Seattle Kraken.
And that was yes, that's right. Yeah.
Carter Hart played out of his mind, so that was good.
Yeah, and I saw Nate Thompson fight last night as well, right? So it's good to see him in the mix too. He's somebody who I got the chance to interview back in the day when I worked for Violent Gentlemen. But that's awesome. Again, another story for another day. And in the in the Central, I think Nathan McKinnon's obviously one of the best players in the league. I don't think that's I think it's an opinion that probably a lot of people share. So I would like to see the Avalanche, kind of get over the hump. I think they've been close in the last couple of years. But ultimately, it would be interesting to see what they look like, further into the playoffs and potentially kind of going for the cup. So, I mean, in terms of the Central, I'm kind of backing the Avalanche this year. And then if we were to go to the Pacific, obviously I write for the Kings. It's an interesting year for the Kings because I think they're looking to flip the switch on that rebuild. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Quinton Byfield getting injured, in preseason kind of complicates things because I think the idea was that he was going to take the next step in his career and probably stick with the club full time this year, maybe. But I think the injection of Arvidsson, who I really like, and I think could potentially, get to 30 again if he stays healthy, and then Philip Deneau down the middle just kind of gives the Kings a really nice, 1-2 punch. And so I'm of the mind that given how weak the Pacific is, that the Kings could, vie for playoff spots. Obviously once they get into the playoffs, they're going to have to contend with the Oilers and the Golden Knights, but still, from my perspective as a Kings contributor, I'd like to see what they can do. I think that's always the most challenging part of a rebuild, obviously, is transitioning out of the rebuild and going back into contention mode. I think the Kings have done a marvelous job over the last 3 or 4 years amassing this cupboard full of highly touted prospects. But
definitely,
it's just that move of then how do you transition those players, because they're not all going to get to stay with the club. So who do you deal to try to get better? Who do you keep? What positions do you put them in? So I'm just really curious to see what LA does this year and next year, because I think these are obviously critical periods and whether or not they could truly flip that switch.
To keep digging into the Kings a little bit more here, I honestly would not be surprised just because of the makeup. Like, I like the moves that they made in the offseason quite a bit. You look at the strength down the middle, bringing in Deneau. You already have Anze Kopitar as one of the best two-way centers in the league. And I think he's like a fine wine, that guy. He's amazing. And then Drew Doughty's one of my favorite players in the league. I don't know why people talk down on him. I never got it. Still don't get it. I think he's phenomenal. And I think when you have something like that to build around, when you have like that elite center, the elite defenseman, and then even Jonathan Quick, who obviously is probably not elite anymore, but was elite for his time, and having him as a backup, I think that's the right way to transition out. If you have to move, maybe a Jonathan Quick down the line, get some assets, you already have a goalie of the future kind of there. But I think you're probably right. You're not going to be able, because Flyers went through this. You're not going to be able to keep all these young guys together, even if you want to. It's just not going to happen. But to start bringing in guys like Arvidsson in there, and bringing Deneau, you create the stability around it. And then these guys, being in a losing culture is a really bad idea. So I think the Kings made the right moves, and I really like the changes they made. I don't know how far they can get in, but the way the Pacific is right now, I could totally see it. Like, I would not put it beyond their reach. And if Kopitar plays the way I think he can, I mean, he can lead that group definitely. It seems like Dustin Brown has still got more left in the tank as well.
Yeah, I mean, like it's funny because there was a period where I think a lot of people were like writing off Dustin Brown, like he's done, right? And then he had a resurgence and he's, scored 30 goals. And like, I think, Kopitar opened the season with a pretty nice night. I think, picking up 5 points.
Yeah.
To your point with Doughty, like, I think he's come into the season with this renewed like sense of determination. I think he's obviously been, outspoken about being snubbed from, potential Olympic rosters. And I think he's one of the few people who actually uses that to fuel him. I think he's also kind of opened up around some of his own challenges over the years with mental health and maybe kind of trying to weigh all this out. So I think he's kind of come into the season, saying that he's in the best shape that he's been in. I think with this renewed determination to show people that he's still one of the top defensemen in the league. So and he's been playing really well so far. So I think if they kind of keep all that together and they're able to kind of bring the young guys up with them, they'll be a really interesting team to watch for.
Well, that's awesome. And I honestly, good luck to the Kings. It was tough for me with the Kings a few years back because, like, from our perspective here, we're like, oh, look, it's the Flyers of the West winning the Stanley Cup. I was like, with John Stevens and Justin Williams, Simone Gagne, who's my favorite player of all time, Richards, Carter. For us, it was hard to watch. I'm not going to lie, but all that is now in the past. And yeah, honestly, I would like to see the Kings get back up there. I don't think it's a good idea to have an LA team that's outside of the playoffs. I think with the population there, I think it's only a good thing to have them in there and have them be a competitive team on a nightly basis. Mm-hmm. All right, Mike, this was a great interview. I really appreciate your time. Anything else you want to give people a kind of an awareness on? Anything else you got coming out? I know you got the book. Obviously, you said it's coming out in the United States next week, I think you said.
Yeah, on 26th.
Yeah. Is there anything else you're working on or any other shows or anything like that you want to give people a shout on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing would be, the book officially drops in the US on October 26th. So you can pick it up, from wherever you like to get books, whether that's Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Powell's. But again, you can also go to your local independent bookseller wherever you live. If they don't have it, you can ask them to order it in. And then, if you follow me on Twitter at Mike Commito, that's where you'll see any updates I have about the book. I'm still going to be doing some stuff for the Kings this year. I've got a story, coming out in the next little bit that I can't talk about just yet, but hopefully it comes out, not too long after this podcast drops. But otherwise, I'll be trying to do some more King stories this year. Again, it's my 4th season going into it with the Kings, and they've been pretty great at kind of letting me explore topics, that are outside of the on-ice product. Although this year is probably the first year in my time with them that, I think there's a little bit of optimism. So maybe we'll stray into some like on ice analysis, but I think there's a lot of great people there who do that. So I'll probably stick to the fun stuff on the side about, what the Kings did off the ice on this day and all that stuff. So yeah, I appreciate it having me on. I appreciate it. And then, those are basically the main things that I've got coming up now. The book is the number one for sure. Absolutely. And please make sure to check out his book. I assume that there's a link that I could put in the details of this video. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can send you the link for the, I think the Amazon one's probably the easiest one because perfect. Pretty much everyone knows how to use that. So I'll send you that and you can throw that in there. I'll put in the details of this video. So guys, make sure to check out the details if you're looking to purchase the book, and I would recommend to do so. Definitely make sure, because obviously it sounds fascinating, to be honest with you. Something I definitely want to read now. All right. Well, thank you again, Mike. Thank you for everybody for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe. Also, a shout out to our sponsor, which I forgot to do in the beginning of the show, Jim's Steaks here. Jim's Steaks on South. Go get cheesesteaks because it's getting cold and it's hockey season, and make sure you buy from them. All right. Thank you again. Remember, everybody, stay gritty.